Hello students, this is Wilson. I'm a NEET Biology faculty. Welcome to Physics for Backbenchers YouTube channel, and this is my second video lecture from Living World chapter. And yesterday class we discussed an introduction about living world, and where we discussed the properties of living organisms and the levels of organization, etc. And today we are going to study diversity in living world. So what is meant by diversity? Diversity means it's very simple. Diversity means difference. Difference is where difference between two different species. This is called diversity. And what we mean by variation? Variation means difference within the same species. That is called variation. And diversity means difference between two different species. That is called diversity. That means if you take the cat is there and if you take the human beings are present. So the difference between two these organisms, two these species is called diversity. And if you take the biodiversity on the earth, it is enormous. That means variety organisms can be seen, variety of plants and variety of animals. And finally, a great diversity can be found on the planet of Earth. Okay, and how these organisms can be differentiated with other organisms. So they may be differentiated in their structure and habit and habitat, mode of nutrition and physiology, etc. So in yesterday class we discussed it. The organisms can be varied from cell to up to organ system level of organization. That means from prokaryotes to eukaryotes, the organisms can be differentiated. Okay, and according to IUCN, yesterday itself we discussed what is meant by IUCN. IUCN stands for International Union for Conservation of Nature. According to this IUCN, the organisms have been identified and described. The number is 1.7 to 1.8 millions. That means till now, how many lakhs of organisms can be identified and described? There are 17 lakh to 18 lakh species of organisms have been identified and described. But as per scientists' predictions, still 7 millions of organisms yet to be discovered. Okay. So then what you got here, as per this IUCN, there are 1.7 to 1.8 millions of organisms are present on the earth. And so these organisms sometimes they vary within the same species. Otherwise, they show great diversity from one species to the another species. That means what you call here, suppose you can able to see a lot of similarities between the species and sometimes a lot of diversity. Okay, so how can you categorize these organisms in their respective position? So this is called diversity. So once again, listen here. We are studying diversity. Diversity means difference, and here biodiversity. That means different forms of life can be seen on the earth. Suppose if you take the word biodiversity was given by the scientist. This is actually this is the pic. We can able to see the biodiversity, and the term biodiversity was coined by Edward Wilson. So biodiversity means different forms of life, and they vary in their habitat and their structure and mode of nutrition and even physiology, etc. And till now, there are 1.7 to 1.8 millions of organisms have been identified and described. So now we need to categorize these organisms in their respective positions. So let us see how we can able to categorize these organisms. So definitely what happened here? So all these organisms, they can be added in their convenient categories. Suppose if we take taxonomy and the systematic. So taxonomy. So what is mean by taxonomy? Taxonomy means what? Taxonomy means the study, simply you can say the study of classification. Classification of organisms. This is called taxonomy. So it's a branch of biology that deals with the identification and nomenclature of living organisms. And these organisms can be classified on the basis of similarities and differences. So just now only we discussed there are 1.7 to 1.8 millions of organisms are there. So how can you identify these organisms and how can you exactly describe these organisms by seeing their what do you call their pictures, otherwise directly, etc. That is the reason we have some of the aids. First of all, taxonomy. Taxonomy means what? It is a branch of biology, and where organisms can be identified, and for them name can be given, and they can be classified. These organisms can be classified on the basis of their similarities and their differences. Okay, next one. Next one is these word, the taxonomy word can be given by the, can be coined by Augustine Pyramus de Candolle, and he was the first scientist. He coined the term taxonomy. So AP de Candolle was the first scientist. He coined the term, he coined the word taxonomy. What you call here by naming and classifying the organisms. That means there are 1.7 to 1.8 millions of organisms means we need to give proper name for them and we need to arrange them in a specific position. So I told you, taxonomy means what here? Into the study of classification of organisms. The term taxonomy was coined by the scientist A.P. de Candolle in the era of what you call here 70s. Actually, is period was 1778 to 1841. And these identifications should be in a systematic manner. That means, suppose we identify the organisms. Suppose you put the examples of humans are present, and if you take the monkeys or chimpanzees, and both can be included in the group of primata. Otherwise, if you take the human beings, if you can place in this primate group, and monkeys, if you can place some other group, so then what happens? It is not systematic. That means whatever the organisms can be they are identifying, that identification and their naming should be in a systematic manner. So let us see what we mean by systematic. Remember, students, it is very important if you are preparing for NEET 2022 examination, you need to have a proper idea the difference between taxonomy means what and these scientists find the term taxonomy and the systematic etc. So let us see here. In Latin, the word the systema, systematic means systema. That means a systematic placing of organisms into groups of taxa on the basis of certain relationships between the organisms. Okay. So based on their relationships, these organisms can be grouped into can be grouped into convenient groups. So what is in what based on their relationships. So once again, listen here. Systematics means systematically the organisms can be placed in a convenient group based on their relationship between the organisms. Okay. So this is called systematics. Which scientist first time used the word systematics? Carolus Linnaeus. You know that binomial nomenclature was proposed by the scientist Carolus Linnaeus. So he was the scientist who used this word first time in his book Systema Naturae. That means Carolus Linnaeus was the first scientist, and he proposed a binomial nomenclature, and also he wrote a book. The book name was Systema Naturae, where in his book he mentioned systematics word. Okay, and the term new systematics was proposed by Julian Huxley in 1940. Okay, so simply I will tell you what is the major difference between taxonomy and systematics. Taxonomy means the study of classification of organisms and based on their similarities. And this taxonomy word was framed by the scientist Augustine Pyramus de Candolle. And systematics means what here? All organisms can be arranged in a convenient group based on their relationship. That means the classification should be in a systematic manner. Which scientist used this word first time? Carolus Linnaeus. And the term new systematics was proposed by the scientist Julian Hansley in 1940. So shall we go for the next slide? So if you go for this one, process of taxonomy. So how can you classify these organisms and what is the method or process that following to classify these organisms? First of all, let us see the characterization. Okay, that means we need to understand their characters before we are classifying these organisms. So that means what you got here, external or internal structure and structure of cell, development process and ecological information. So it's very important before you are classifying the organisms. So their characterization is very important. First, we need to understand the organism characterization. So what kind of characters can be observed here? Organisms, that is their external structure and internal structure and structure of cell and development process, the way how these organisms can be developed and their ecological information. That means, and where in which kind of ecosystem these organisms are present, either terrestrial ecosystem or forest ecosystem or aquatic ecosystem, etc. So first of all, the process of taxonomy means we need to understand and we need to observe the organism characterization. And then after what happened here? Identification. Identification means what? Identification is the correct description of an organism and its definition in scientific, what you call, there's a scientific name. Okay. So identification means what we call based on their morphological characters. You can able to identify. Suppose if you take the, if you can able to easily identify the difference between birds, otherwise the difference between cats and rats, etc. So identification is the correct description of an organism, its recognition with scientific name. Okay, that means we are using scientific name also. Suppose if you take the Solanum tuberose, we are using for describing what you call here potato, and next one is classification. Classification means what here, and after observing their characters and after our identifying these organisms can be grouped into, can be added into the convenient categories that is called taxa based on their characters. Suppose you know that, and the best example is if you take the school, you know the first standard to up to 11th standard and 12th standard, the students can be divided based on their level of learning things. So here also the same thing. So organisms after they're observing their characters and after identifying a particular organisms, these organisms can be added into convenient categories, convenient taxa based on their characters. So this is called classification. An organism can be included into their convenient categories, convenient groups based on their characters is called classification. And after that, what happened here? Nomenclature. Nomenclature means what? Naming. Naming of an organism is called nomenclature. What happened here? In this, we're providing standardized names for the organisms. The particular organism is known by the same name all over the world. Suppose if you take in India, there are names of the Rama is there and Krishna is there, and for plants like neem is there, potato is there, tomato is there. But these are actually, which are also known as the local names. Local names means suppose name is there. Name is a local name. And if you take for the human beings also, we have the names Rama, Krishna, etc. And if tomato, potato, brinjal, etc. So these are all nothing but local names. But these names cannot be used. Means an organism should be that an organism should known by the same name all over the world. Okay? This is suppose if you take the if you take the examples of here nomenclature means if you take what you call here potato Solanum tuberosum. That means Solanum is this genera and tuberosum means this specific epithet. So based on the scientific name, the organism can be known anywhere. This is called an organism can be known by the same name all over the world is called nomenclature. That means the name should be in scientific manner. That is called nomenclature or naming of the organisms. Okay. And suppose here this naming with two components. If you take any example, there are two components are there for a single species. And this binomial nomenclature was proposed by Carolus Linnaeus. Just now only we discussed. A species which has two, what do you call here, two names. One is a generic name, and second one is it's a specific epithet. Suppose if we take, we'll take the name example here. It is Ajadi Racta indica. Ajadi Racta indica. And that means what you call here, Ajadi Racta is a, what you call here, a generic name, and specific epithet means the species can be seen in India. Okay. And one more example, Oryza sativa. Oryza is a generic name and it is a genus and where we can include different kinds of species. Okay, and if it is the examples of human beings, so Homo sapiens are there. Okay, and ratus, naza, Solanum melangina, Solanum tuberosa. So different names are present here. Okay, binomial nomenclature was proposed by Carolus Linnaeus, and according to the scientist, and each organism, according to this binomial nomenclature, each scientific name has two components. Scientific name has two components. One is its generic name, and second one is its specific epithet name. So remember, in examination point of view, sometimes they may ask you questions. Binomial nomenclature was proposed by. Then answer is Carolus Linnaeus. So according to this binomial nomenclature, what happened here? That scientific name has two components. One is generic name, and one is a specific epithet name. Okay, and there are different rules can be provided to name the organism. So there are ICBN and ICZN. ICBN stands for International Code for Botanical Nomenclature, and these according to ICBN for the plants, especially for the plants, they are giving some of the rules and regulations for naming scientific naming of the plants. And geological purpose, International Code for Geological Nomenclature, and ICZN, which is naming for animals. So ICBN is naming for which one, plants, and ICZN, which is giving names for the animals. So let us see once again. We will recall what are the topics we discussed. We discussed the process of taxonomy. That means if you want to classify any organism, there are certain rules and regulations are present here. That means we need to identify their characterization, and we need to identify in a proper manner, and the organisms can be added into the fundamental category, that means classification. And after that, name can be given to the particular organism. The name should be in a standardized manner. That means we should give scientific name. And according to binomial nomenclature, the scientific name has two components. That means generic name and the specific epithet name. This binomial nomenclature was proposed by the scientist Carolus Linnaeus. And for naming of plants and animals, in case of the plants, we have ICBN, and for naming of animals, we have ICZN. ZN. So let us see. New slide. We'll go for the new slide. Now we're studying the classification. Classification means what, and what is the major importance of this classification? Suppose if we take this classification, and we already we discussed it. What classification is very important. Why? Because there are 1.7 to 1.8 millions of organisms are there. That is the reason these organisms, these entire organisms can be included in their convenient category. That is the reason to conventional categories some easily observable characters. So that means so how this classification can be done? Need for classification to organize the vast number of plants and animals into categories. It could be named and we can remember and study it and understood. That means till now actually there are many medicinal plants out there. Okay, and from the centuries ago till now, we are studying about them and we are preserving some of the plants for future generation. Okay, and we don't know which plant is useful for human beings and which animal is useful for the human beings. So that is the reason in a conventional way we need to classify these organisms so that it is it's helpful for and studying purpose and for reference purpose for future. Okay, and studying of one organism which gives an idea about the rest of other members. Suppose if you take the if studying a rare plant, we can able to understand their previous history also. And let us see the what you got here, the history of classification, how this classification can be done in the past centuries. Suppose if you take third and fourth centuries BC, Aristotle and others organized, categorized plants and animals. They given identified few thousands or more living organisms. Yesterday itself, we discussed that Aristotle was considered as father of biology. Why he is calling father of biology? Was the first scientist, and he did first adaptation to classify all living things. That is the reason he is considered as father of biology. And next one is Hippocrates, and we are calling him father of medicine. He listed organisms with medicinal values. Okay, and suppose if you take India, Uchayurveda is there. There are many medicinal plants are available. And Aristotle and student Aristotle itself who discussed Theophrastus made first attempt to classify all organisms without stressing their medicinal value. They tried to classify the plants and animals on the basis of their form and their habitat. Of course, at that time they don't know their medicinal value, but on the basis of their habitat and their form, they did first attempt to classify the plants and the animals. And next one is it is followed by the Pliny Elder in 23 to 79 AD, who introduced the system that artificial system is Historia Naturalis. And next, John Ray was the first scientist. The term species was coined by John Ray. Okay. And also the Carolus Linnaeus was the first scientist with the naturalist in 18th century. Is also known as the father of taxonomy, and he proposed a binomial nomenclature system. And his famous book, he mentioned what is the different species, that is called Species Plantarum in 1753, described 5,900 species of plants, and Systema Naturae in 1758 described 4,200 species of animals. Okay, so that means that they did major efforts to classify all these organisms. By their efforts, right now we have been described there are 1.7 to 1.8 millions of organisms. Okay, so thank you very much, and we'll continue in the next class.